Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We are recording on the final day of March. It's been a very, very busy month here in Happy Valley, featuring the return of Penn State football action to the practice fields. Last week, we got a chance to get back out on those practice fields. We brought you a lot of developments from them here on the podcast with our last episode that dropped last Thursday. Daniel Gallen was on with us, breaking down a lot of what we witnessed and experienced there, watching Penn State go through about 40 minutes of action during its opening practice period. We'll be back on the practice field tomorrow, Tuesday. Hopefully you are locked in with us at lions247.com. We are still offering that 50% for a full year of VIP coverage, or 1 year or 1 month for $1. That is going to be extended. I said till March 31st on our last episode. I got news this morning. We're extending that into April. So still an opportunity to jump on board as we cover spring practices and all the recruiting happenings that tend to come with this spring period. And we've got a lot to dive into. To start off this show with Tyler Calvaruso, a little bit later on this episode, Daniel Gallen will re-enter the conversation. We'll do our best to bring you what we witnessed at Pro Day and kind of the takeaways from there, who stepped up, who didn't perform, and ultimately what do we hear from a bunch of Penn State's NFL draft hopefuls. We also have a few more follow-up notes from the first week of Penn State spring practice to follow along. But like I said, Tyler Calvaruso going to kick things off with us now. Tyler made the trip up here to Happy Valley on Friday, did some work from my house here in Happy Valley. So always happy to get you in the flesh and get some face-to-face time. You were part of our Pro Day coverage over at lions247.com. But of course, before you actually left my residence, you already had to get your recruiting stories up. I think you got two of them fired away. One of them was about Khalil Taylor, top 50 prospect in the country, big-time talent from Western Pennsylvania. And you wrote about the big impression that Penn State made on him, specifically conversations with James Franklin during his visit to Thursday's Penn State practice. You wrote the story Friday before you hit the road. And then on Saturday, there was a commitment from Khalil Taylor to Penn State's 2027 recruiting class.
Yeah, it's still early in that 27 cycle, but even with a guy like Khalil Taylor, who has been so consistent in his praise of Penn State throughout his recruitment, I mean, going back to February, we made it out for a junior day visit. He straight up told me, look, Penn State's my leader right now. So you were starting to get the sense that if there was going to be another early commitment in that 27 class, it could really come from Taylor. That was starting to look like a real possibility heading into the spring. And then during the week leading up to his spring practice visit on Thursday, some of that buzz had started to grow a little bit louder. Taylor told me he wasn't quite ready just yet coming out of that visit. So guess what? He made it back on Saturday and decided to get things done. So there you go. It's a hell of a get for Penn State. I know people are going to look at a 27 commit and be like, oh, it's so early. There's X amount of time to go between now and the early signing period. I get all that. But we talk about needle movers, potential needle movers often on this show, especially at the wide receiver position. Khalil Taylor fits that bill really to a T. He's electric in a couple of different ways. He's electric with the ball in his hands. He can separate downfield, uses his speed to win over the top. You know, having a guy who can make plays with the ball in his hands, that's a big sticking point for Penn State's wide receiver recruiting. We always talk about the separating and winning vertically. That's huge. That's obviously what Penn State looks for consistently every single cycle. That's what they want. They also want guys who they get the ball in space. They can make defenders miss, get to the second level, make big plays, rip off chunk plays in that regard. So Taylor has that versatility to him. That's why he's a big-time prospect in this 27 class. Number 46 nationally, number 9 athlete in the nation right now. Penn State, again, recruiting him as wide receiver. That's going to be his spot in Happy Valley. Number 2 prospect in Pennsylvania. Penn State is off to a really strong start on the in-state recruiting front. They've got Khalil Taylor on board now. They've got Kamon Spell on board. We'll get to him in a little bit. But this is a really, really big early cycle get. And look, if we got to call a spade, it's another example of James Franklin and Terry Smith going into Western Pennsylvania and really getting anyone that they truly want in the region. It's an area they've dominated recently, and that's the case again here.
It's been a multi-cycle stretch where it does feel like they do the picking and choosing. They determine who's worthy of an offer. And if it's a legitimate power conference kind of guy that they determine is a take, they're usually in the driver's seat for these guys. I mean, there's been some battles there in Pittsburgh. Some guys maybe landed in the SEC. Not all of them stuck around in the SEC. And so it's interesting to see Penn State have this kind of success reaching west, and it continues now. Khalil Taylor, as you referenced, number 2 player in the state of Pennsylvania. They've got 2 of those top prospects with him and running back Kamon Spell. We have some stuff to talk about. Leighton Von Brandt is the 3rd commitment in that class. He is one of the premier offensive tackles in the nation out of Delaware. And so you're talking about a really strong early, yes, early foundation for that 2027 cycle. But if you can see Penn State stack up another playoff run on top of what they already did and the kind of fireworks that we think may be in store for this program, that's a class to watch out for because they are already really cooking with the trio, and there's a lot of room to grow, and they've got a lot of these prospects coming through during spring practice and then into the summer with the camp circuit. When it comes to Taylor, 22 total touchdowns last season, 51 catches, nearly 1,000 receiving yards. He's labeled an athlete. He's going to play receiver at Penn State, but the running back spot is what really also commanded our attention over the weekend, Tyler. Penn State didn't lose anybody from its classes. It didn't add anybody to its classes at running back, but it got a great level of stability, it seems, in both the 2026 cycle and the 2027 cycle. Let's stick with 2027 because we just talked about Khalil Taylor bringing an elite presence at receiver there. They already had one of those at running back with Kamon Spell. He committed before his sophomore year last August. He has warranted interest from across the power conference landscape, and Notre Dame and Jaywan Sider were knocking on his door of late. And tell us what we need to know, Tyler Calvaruso. Now that we closed out March, it's been interesting to track Sider's relationships with these running backs who have remained committed to Penn State during the process.
Yeah, Saturday was a crazy one in the best way possible. I mean, for Penn State, really within the span of an hour, we had Khalil Taylor's commitment. We had Kamon Spell coming out and saying, hey, look, I'm shutting things down, locking in with Penn State. About as big of an early cycle in-house recruiting win you can possibly have at this juncture. I mean, Kamon Spell is an elite prospect, and there was a little bit of uncertainty following Jaywan Sider's departure for Notre Dame, no doubt about it. And he was very candid about that with me when I hit him up after Sider's departure. You know, he was kind of concerned about some things, uncertain about the direction things were heading, but all of those, potential issues, concerns have been answered in full by James Franklin, Stan Drayton, and the rest of the Penn State staff. And Spell let Franklin know the good news on Saturday, made it back up to campus, said, hey, look, I'm locked in. I'm not going to be taking any other visits. Notre Dame was a potential visit destination next month. Ohio State was a potential visit destination next month. So there were some talks about getting out and seeing some other programs, making some trips, saying, hey, look, things are a little bit different now at Penn State. How do I fit in elsewhere? But that is not going to be happening. And again, it comes with the caveat of it being early. I don't expect Jaywan Sider to quit here. I mean, he has that relationship with Spell already built in. And the fact of the matter is, Penn State fans know this. Sider doesn't quit on the recruiting trail. They've learned that throughout his tenure. So I don't anticipate he'll go away. Some other programs probably won't go away as well. But from the Spell perspective, his mindset right now, he's locked in. And that's about as big of a statement Stan Drayton and the rest of the Penn State staff could possibly make early in his tenure with the program. I mean, going out and locking a player like that down, even though he was already in your class, it's huge.
Yeah, we gained our first look at Stan Drayton working with Nick Singleton, K. Charnow, and the rest of that running back room on the field last week, but he has been underway with trying to pick up on these recruiting relationships, specifically with guys who are already on board before you start to venture out and build relationships with uncommitted players. And we've spent a lot of time, Tyler, it seems to me, speaking about Kamon Spell, the recruit, and kind of how that process has played out over the last month and a half since Jaywan Sider departed campus. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Kamon Spell, the talent, because he is the number 3 overall running back in 24/7 Sports rankings for that 2027 class. Additionally, he's a guy that when you look across the board and talk about fringe 5-star talent that's going to be under consideration for a 5th star down the road, he's one of the few running backs in that cycle right now who kind of qualify in that category. So what is it about Spell that halfway through his high school career makes him a no doubt about it pickup for Penn State and somebody that coaches across the conference and across the country are going to try to knock out from the Nittany Lions' grasp?
Yeah, and I'm going to be pretty forthright with my opinion here on Spell. I think he's a 5-star guy when it's all said and done. I truly do. I think he has a case to be the number 1 back in the country, which is all said and done, to be completely honest with you. And here's why. His blend of size, speed, power. Some guys are big, but even at the high school level, they're not quite at the point where they're put their shoulder down and run through you. They'll try to be finesse guys. Nope. Kamon Spell knows exactly who he is as a running back. If he's got to run through you, he'll run through you. If he's got to use his speed to get to the edge, get into the second level, he will do that. Just look at McKeesport's playoff run. Look at the numbers Spell put up in a 2-game span. He accumulated almost 600 yards on the ground in 2 games. I mean, that's ridiculous no matter how you slice it. Regardless of level of competition, anything like that, any argument anyone wants to have, that's ridiculous in a playoff game especially. And he got better and better as his sophomore season went on. He opened things up with a bang. I think he had a 200-yard 3-touchdown game right off the bat. in a really tight McKeesport loss. He only got better as the year went on. Again, he's versatile. He's not just a good runner. He can catch passes out of the backfield when needed. We all know Penn State likes that out of its back. So we're not just talking about, we also about, keeping the best players in Pennsylvania. Spell's not just the top in-state guy. He's one of the top in the country. And for Penn State to strike early with Spell, with the original commitment ahead of his sophomore season, that was huge. And now you fight that fight to keep him on board. You keep him locked in. That's the direction you want to be heading, because you want a guy like Kamon Spell on campus as often as possible, selling the vision for that 27 class. Because what you said is spot on, especially for the potential Penn State making a deep playoff run and the impact that could have on recruiting. The Northeast is loaded in 27. Pennsylvania, there's a lot of talent in 27. You have Khalil Taylor on board now. You have Kamon Spell in place really as a pillar of the class. Guy's been entrenched in doing peer recruiting within the region already. That's only going to help you in a pretty massive way. And it's again, I keep saying it's early, but 27, it has the potential to be really something for this Penn State staff.
Spell looking to follow the likes of Journey Brown, Saquon Barkley, Nick Singleton, and Miles Sanders as in-state running back standouts at the high school level, came to Happy Valley, found their success there. So we'll see how it works out for Spell. But before he gets to campus, we got to see if Messiah Mickens ultimately makes it to campus. One of the premier running backs in the region for the 2026 cycle, attends Harrisburg High School, has been committed for a while now to Penn State. But, of course, the Jaywan Sider departure and then the Notre Dame interest. And we saw Messiah Mickens announce plans to make an official visit out to South Bend, Indiana. But scratch the record. We've got an update there as well at running back. What's the latest on Messiah Mickens coming out of, once again, quite an eventful weekend to finish off March?
He's in the same boat as Spell, where he got back to campus, caught up with Franklin, caught up with San Andreas, and said, hey, look, I'm in. I'm not going to be doing these other visits. I mean, even more so in the immediate for Mickens, with him being a 26 guy, of course, he was going to get out and not just take official visits, but it was sounding like he was going to take some spring practice visits elsewhere too. So you never know what's going to happen once those visits take place.
Can I tell you something? It's a phrase you don't hear often anymore, Tyler, because I think people got tired of it. It feels like a lot of commitments are this way these days, but it was very easy to read it as a, quote, soft commit. Again, the phrase you don't hear often now. I think everyone views almost all commitments as soft in some way because of the current climate in college football. But that's where I was at. It's like you're carrying the commitment label, but you're going to kind of go on this tour of college football. It's a tough thing to do in balancing both of those acts. And we know the Penn State staff would prefer it one way rather than the other, but they're not going to force that issue on anyone. It certainly seems like Messiah Mickens was able to reach this conclusion on his own. We're still 5 months out of his senior season, but how big of a deal is it that he felt confident enough to go on the record, share this information, knowing that Jaywan Sider is going to be disappointed by it in Indiana? It's
big because you had not just Notre Dame, but multiple other schools knocking on the door. And North Carolina was carrying a little bit of appeal with Bill Belichick down there now. And that's such a big part of Penn State's overall recruiting approach. Not pressuring kids, saying, hey, look, you do what you got to do. But at the end of the day, when you can make that decision whenever you feel fit, but where home is. Where home has been since you were a sophomore at Trinity and Camp Hill. Now you're at Harrisburg doing the thing over there with Kevin Brown, who's locked in this Penn State 26 class. Where home is. You make your decision. And Nick has decided to make his on Saturday, saying, hey, look, shutting things down, locking in, really just reiterating the sentiment that we picked up from him throughout his recruitment, that Penn State, even though his relationship with Jaywan Sider was excellent, it was something Messiah has mentioned to me countless times. And when I got to see him in action during the playoffs in the fall, Sider was one of the first things that he brought up about Penn State. So that relationship was huge, no doubt about it. But he's always loved Penn State as an institution. He's loved Penn State's offense under Andy Kotelnicki, and he loves James Franklin. He loves the way James Franklin runs his program. He sees a fit in that kind of culture. So for Penn State, it's one less thing to worry about. Now you focus on adding a second back to this class, which has been the priority predating Sider's departure. Add a second quality back to this class with Mickens. They've got some pretty quality names on the board. And Messiah's another one of those guys, especially on the in-state front. He's done his fair share of trying to get guys with him to state college. Anytime you can keep a guy like that, it just adds on to who he is as a player and a prospect.
Yeah, we've got Mickens at 5'10", 200 pounds. He's a top 24/7 prospect. He's the number 14 player at the running back position for the 2026 class, the number 6 overall prospect in the state of Pennsylvania, one of 2 commits from Harrisburg High School, along with elite offensive tackle Kevin Brown from that program. And we'll keep tabs on those running backs, but if you're a Penn State fan listening or following along with our coverage, you're feeling a lot better about those 2 than you were going into last weekend. And so that's a good place to be. Before we turn our attention to Daniel Gallen, get into some of the pro day recap and talk about some more takeaways from week 1 of Penn State spring practices, there were 2 other campus visitors that we wanted to get to with you, Tyler, and one of them is at the quarterback position. He's actually a guy that we discussed here in the podcast a few times about being a multi-position prospect. We talked about, could he follow that Tyler Warren path toward college tight end from high school quarterback, but Peyton Falzone is locked in as a top 24/7 quarterback recruit right now. He's burgeoning with this really impressive athleticism as well. He's flashed that during his track season, and he got back to campus with Penn State. We know Penn State carries a commit at quarterback in the 2026 class from Southern California, Troy Hune. That's going back to last summer. Tyler, how relevant was this latest visit for Peyton Falzone? How much in play could a 2-quarterback class be? And have we just moved on from the tight end conversation with him?
It's definitely relevant because those conversations about the potential for it to possibly be a 2 QB class are ongoing. I think in this day and age in the portal area, maybe the days of locking in on 1 QB classes, maybe you've always had a second guy in a class if you can, just because, you never know who's going to leave you in the offseason. You never know what direction things are going to go. Having a 2-guy class, if, that flies with everyone already on board, it's a dynamic you could possibly make work. So those conversations are ongoing. And when it comes to Falzone, the pitch has clearly shifted to playing that position, which I think is something Falzone appreciates. I think his work speaks for itself, right? Traveling out to Ohio consistently on his own accord to work with Brad Mandler, it tells you what position he wants to play at the next level. And I have to give Peyton a ton of credit because I think the work he's put in with Brad, I think it's noticeable. I think he has fine-tuned some things that, maybe were quote-unquote weaknesses, and he looks really good as a passer right now. He looks like an improved quarterback heading into his senior season at Nazareth. And he got back with the staff on Thursday, and there were some productive conversations had, caught up with James Franklin, caught up with Andy Kotelnicki, caught up with Danny O'Brien, caught up with Trace McSorley, that's the first time I've gotten the chance to say that about a recruit on this podcast. That's pretty cool. But caught up with Trace McSorley. It seemed like everything went well. It seemed like the dialogue that was exchanged was a productive one. Brian Doan got the chance to catch up with Falzone over Lines 24/7. It was a great interview, really in-depth about the intricacies of that visit and what Penn State sees for Falzone moving forward. So I definitely suggest our readers check that one out. But it's definitely a little bit of the tide turning, and it's something to monitor moving forward because Falzone has always expressed a pretty clear interest in Penn State. We weren't quite sure positionally what the pitch was going to be. Originally he was looking, hey, look, maybe you play more of that Tyler Warren role because we saw him run routes after that camp during the summer. And so there was some, what is he at the next level? Because athletically he's got it. No doubt about it. Size, speed, he's got it. But he's coming along as a passer now. He's starting to carry more appeal. Penn State's taking note of that, and they're pursuing him as such.
I know some of our listeners' ears may have perked up. They heard, he's been working with quarterbacks coach Brad Mandler. Where do I know that name? That is the quarterbacks coach for Drew Aller and also Ethan Grunkemeyer, who right now we expect to be the number 1 and number 2 quarterbacks on Penn State's depth chart. Tyler, let's finish this conversation with one more recruit to get to. And why don't we show the defensive side of the ball some love? Although I will note, Messiah Mickens was an All-American at Max Preps for his work at linebacker. That kid can ball on both sides of the ball. But when it comes to Rodney Colton, former SEC commit, firmly on Penn State's radar in this 2026 cycle at linebacker, what do we need to be aware of as Dan Connor starts to build his class as the official linebackers coach for the Nittany Lions?
So he falls into that category of he's a non-region guy with a lot of SEC interest. So you got to get him to campus before we can really gauge what direction things are heading. Penn State got him to campus on Saturday. And I'm looking to catch up with Colton here pretty soon. But from the conversations I've had outside of, direct contact with Colton, it sounds like Penn State made a move up the list. It sounds like Penn State is garnering more consideration as a serious contender now. If he's going to leave that Southeast region, Penn State has positioned itself to, be a viable option. He's looking far and wide. I don't think distance is necessarily going to be a factor. I still think the SEC has pull. Tennessee, has done a really good job with Colton since he backed off his commitment to South Carolina during the winter. But Penn State getting him to campus, I wrote this on Saturday morning when previewing the expected group at Penn State. Getting Colton to campus before his official visit, which is slated for that May 30th to June 1st weekend, that was a big win. Because you always want to get a guy like that to town whenever you can. Non-region guy high on your board. He doesn't have anything going on the weekend. Let's do what we can to get him out to campus. Dan Connor and the staff did just that, and they made a pretty positive impression. So,
can I add something, Tyler?
Of course.
For the final weekend of March, Penn State got pretty lucky with the weather for having a Georgia kid up on campus. I was wearing shorts and a T-shirt on Saturday walking outside, so not a bad time to showcase campus to Rodney Colton making his trip up from Georgia.
Yeah, someone said on the board, I forget who it was. Can we have all of our spring practice visits in 80-degree weather? Yeah, I think the staff would love that situation. But hey, look, that could only help, man. It was a beautiful day in State College. It was a beautiful day throughout Pennsylvania. Colton got to experience that, and he got to experience some good football out there on the practice field. I heard one thing that has popped up in conversation with Colton is getting out and seeing that defense, seeing how Dan Connor works with his linebackers was really important to him. He had a lot of questions answered, and probably more so now than before, you could see himself playing in that defense and playing for a guy like Connor. Interesting.
And we're all curious to get a longer look at that linebacker group. A lot of unproven yet talented commodities in that room. Colton is a top 24/7 talent, 6'1", 220 pounds, out of Noonan High School in Georgia, number 16 linebacker nationally. And as Tyler said, this should be kind of the appetizer to the main event when he gets back on campus for an official visit down the road. Tyler, anything else to add before we say goodbye and shift gears and talk to Daniel?
It's going to be another busy week, more spring practice visits. So definitely stay tuned to what we have going on. And it's a good time to follow Penn State recruiting. I can tell you that. It starts to get really, really fun once the spring practice visits start to fall into place, because then you got official visits right around the corner. And you're going to see the bulk of this Penn State 26 class come together. And, look, you're seeing some 27 class movement as well. So there's a lot going on right now. Just got to stay tuned and see what's next.
Stay tuned and stay engaged with all the recruiting coverage over at Lions247.com. If this 20-minute segment you get once or twice a week isn't enough, we got you covered on a day-to-day basis. 50% off, full year of VIP coverage, $1 for 1 month. As I said, that's been extended into April a bit now. So a great time of the year to jump on board. Tyler, always appreciate it. Regardless of the time of year, it's always a winning conversation with you. Thank you for taking the time with us today. And good to see you the other day back up here in State College.
Yeah, for sure. It was great to catch up with everyone, man. Thanks for having me back.
All right. Let's talk to our other colleague, Daniel Gallen, who was out there in Haluba Hall with us on Friday, watching several Penn State draft hopefuls work out in front of representatives from 30 different NFL franchises. Daniel, good to see you again. Hope you had a good weekend, and we got plenty to talk about once again.
Definitely. There's a lot to unpack, some real numbers to talk about from Friday, and let's get into it.
Well, I thought we could begin with Pro Day. We do have some more observations to come from our first week of Penn State football practice. Again, we'll be back on the practice field Tuesday in about 27 hours from now. Get a chance to see this team again. But, Daniel, going back to Friday morning, we checked in early there, got to see the familiar faces that we've come to cover for the last several years. But the two primary names on that Pro Day list that everyone was gravitating toward, Abdul Carter one, Tyler Warren the other, they were there to support their teammates. They were there ultimately to get interviewed by us, the reporters, but that was it for different reasons. And so let's begin with Abdul Carter, considering he's been under that consideration to be the number one pick to the Tennessee Titans. It seems like they're trending towards Cam Ward, the Miami quarterback right now. But there was Abdul Carter with his parents, with super agent Drew Rosenhaus, who's been a relevant name in the game for a very long time. And you got a chance to speak with him. You wrote about it as well on Friday. Tell us what you learned about Abdul Carter's situation, his desires, as we're now less than a month away from the NFL draft.
Yeah, I think the one thing to take away just from the start was that the reasoning that they gave for Carter not working out at Pro Day is he's continuing to rehab that shoulder the injury that he suffered in the Fiesta Bowl and played through in the Orange Bowl. It didn't seem like this decision had anything to do with the foot injury that popped up when he was at the combine. Carter was, he's kind of funny when he was asked about that. He said that he found out about that the same time everybody else did, that, he was playing through that. It was called like a stress reaction in his foot. But overall, it was definitely more of the same from what we've heard from Abdul Carter over the end of his Penn State career. just that confidence and belief in himself that he has, that, he believes he can be the number one pick in the draft. He reiterated that, he thinks that he's someone that can really affect games in a lot of different ways. And, I posed the question to him. I reframed it a little bit. He had just been asked, why do you think you should be the number one pick? And then I said, and I know that Carter is a football guy. I think that he's someone who, loves the game, watches film, likes to take away different things, and has thoughts on how, the game is played today at the NFL level. And so I framed the question as, why should an NFL team take an edge rusher with the number one pick instead of a quarterback? And he said that he believes that great pass rushers can affect a game and control a game just as much as a good quarterback can. He said that you look at some of the recent Super Bowls. I mean, we just saw what the Eagles did to Patrick Mahomes, a couple months ago in that Super Bowl. And, so he said that, a great edge rusher can make everyone around him better, impact the game by himself. And that was some of his reasoning. Do the Titans believe that? We'll see. It seems like there's been some steam around, the 2, 3, 4 spots. Carter met with the Browns on Thursday night before the combine. He said they went out to dinner at the tavern downtown. They said he had meetings with the Giants and Patriots coming up after that. So we'll see. I mean, every once in a while I'll come across a mock draft that has him down at number 5 to the Jaguars or number 6 to the Raiders. It's really hard for me to see that happening. But it's the type of thing where you can be the best player, the best prospect in the draft. But once you factor in team needs and value and all these different things, the picture changes a little bit. But right now, Abdul Carter thinks he's number 1. That's what he's been saying for a long time.
Well, I'll just tell you what, his predecessor, Micah Parsons, might do him some favors, maybe before kickoff, in terms of setting a new standard for how edge rushers get paid in the league. When you look at who's getting paid the most guaranteed money right now in the NFL, it's obviously the quarterbacks. It's always going to be the quarterbacks. But the two positions that even are in that conversation with them, one is wide receiver, a quarterback's best friend, and the other is the edge rushers, the quarterback's biggest nemesis. And so it all ultimately revolves around the quarterback, right, Daniel? But
Yes.
When you talk about the edge rusher, this is a place to get premium money. And let's face it, if we were talking about Abdul Carter being a linebacker prospect right now, wouldn't be that rosy long-term about maybe financial opportunity.
I mean, after the Blue-White game last year, he said that basically said that this decision was financially motivated. And he kind of reiterated that on Pro Day when he was asked about, looking back on making his switch from linebacker to edge. And, he said that everything that they looked at, I think including the money, has really borne out over this process.
Be fun to follow. Again, just a few weeks left in this, and same deal for Tyler Warren, who, Abdul Carter is going to show every ounce of confidence. He's going to declare himself the number 1 pick. Tyler Warren, as you'd expect, is pretty much the opposite of that. He just wants to find out where he has to report for work and where he's going to be wearing a uniform come August in preseason camp. He did not participate. He did not give us a total reason for that. He just basically said he's to the point right now where his focus is on being ready to hit the ground running when he gets in with his franchise, being fully healthy and prepared to compete come preseason camp. He didn't insinuate that he was dealing with any kind of injury recovery, but I think you talked about it on the board a little bit, because there were some people on our board, you understand, who are like, what's the deal? You got a chance to work out for 30 NFL teams here. You're trying to raise your NFL stock. Why aren't you? And you said there are certain players who have enough on film that they simply stand to lose more perhaps in a setting like this than to gain. Would you kind of qualify Tyler Warren and what he's done at the tight end position as one of those people?
Yeah, I think that Warren could probably only hurt himself by working out, in terms of putting different numbers on tape or putting numbers down. And then you can compare these numbers to different guys and you can get into it there. We saw with like Harold Fannin at the combine, the Bowling Green tight end. He was someone who I think was being talked about as like a day 2 guy in different respects, maybe even back end of the first round. He goes to Indianapolis, did not put together an impressive showing, and now he's being talked about more in that day 3 conversation. And Warren, I think there are less questions about him coming out and his fit at the next level than there would have been with someone like Fannin. But I think that when you're up in this tier of being a prospect, there's a lot of decisions that are made on the margins, and every little bit factors in. And talking to some other people on the beat, other things that, in the context of the tight ends, the other tight ends that are high on people's boards are injured. So, Warren has the chance to separate himself a little bit right now and keep that separation. And I think also, too, the way that I was looking at it is that he plays a position that teams value differently across the board at tight end. You look at some of the tight ends that go really high in the draft. I mean, like Kyle Pitts was the number 4 overall pick, and it's kind of like, what has he done? There's been other tight ends that have gone really high that haven't necessarily panned out. And so I think that if you're someone like Tyler Warren, like a great 40 time, I don't think is going to convince someone that they need to draft you. I think that for him, he's shown this body of work. You would assume that he's interviewing well, behind the scenes, just given our interactions with him, and what he brings to the table there. But for me, I was like everyone else, I was disappointed that he wasn't getting timed. He wasn't working out. We couldn't see him go through these things one last time. But I completely understand it. Like when you're at this point, I think it's pretty locked in, like where his range is, and there wasn't really anything he could do to help it at this point.
Selfishly would have been great to see him out there running a few more routes for Drew Aller before they went their separate ways, but we didn't get to see that. Drew Aller only threw to Julian Fleming during pro day. And Tyler Warren said that the quarterback usage that he had over the course of that 2024 campaign, which of course another differentiating factor between him and other tight ends, was what he was able to do on the ground and be that presence. He said it has come up quite a bit in conversation, maybe not as much as we think it would with NFL teams, but it certainly is something that is among that dialogue. And I think Tyler Warren generally comes across as a guy who he's done with the draft process. He's going to go meet with teams. He's going to go, certainly ace these interviews, I'd imagine, but he don't want to talk about it. He doesn't really want to toot his own horn. It's basically the same Tyler Warren that we were introduced to when he committed to Penn State as a rising high school senior out of Atlee, Virginia. He's been the same guy, and he continues to be. And so we wish him well, but we don't have not a lot to glean from that interview, because kind of in standard Tyler Warren fashion, that's the way it goes in a lot of those conversations. One nugget I will share here that I didn't include in the story on Tyler that I posted on Friday, he said he feels like Luke Reynolds was the most impressive freshman tight end he's seen come through the program during his 5 years and nearly 6 years now, if he's monitoring the team a little bit around the program, being aware of these tight ends. And he thinks that Luke Reynolds has a chance to really go down in the history books here at Penn State among those tight end players. He's a guy that's pushing to maybe replace Warren in the starting lineup here as a sophomore. Daniel, we can go in a few different directions for the other guys, because quite frankly, the storyline for this draft class has been Abdul Carter, Tyler Warren, and the other guys. I openly wonder if it wouldn't be more about the trio and the other guys if KJ Winston had been able to play a full schedule and been able to show his versatility and range during a playoff run for Penn State. He was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week in the season opening game last year down in West Virginia. Then he didn't finish game 2, and he never came back for a game in the remainder of his Nittany Lions career. Coming off of a serious knee injury, he went out there and clocked back-to-back 4.50 40-yard dashes. He didn't participate in position drills. We didn't see him out there going full-fledged. But I'll tell you what, the other pro day participants were really excited to see that for KJ Winston coming through, not far removed from that injury last September. You had a chance to sit down, write a story about his experience at pro day, what might come next for KJ. Talk us through a little bit about where he's at in his process and ultimately how he's looking to overcome the loss of 14 games on his college football resume.
Yeah, KJ Winston said that he's 5 months into his rehab process. He would have suffered the injury a little bit more than 6 months ago at this point in September. And he said that he wanted to show that he could run. He wanted to show these teams where he was in the process. He said that he'll be 100% when training camp starts, when he'll have to report into that in mid-July or so. And so he feels like he is, on time, on schedule. I think March 1st was the date that was thrown around when Adam Schefter first reported what Winston's injury was when he declared. Obviously, that came and went with Winston not doing anything at the combine. But he feels like he's on schedule. He feels like that he's getting stronger. He's going through this process on a regular basis. He said that the 40s that he ran at Pro Day, that was the second time that he's, I think, done like an all-out 40 during the rehab process. He said he ran 4.44 before he left training to come back to Penn State to get ready for Pro Day. And he said before the injury, he was running in the 4.3s. So there still is some room for improvement for him. And you would assume that as he goes along, he'll get stronger. We know that if an NFL team has questions about his athleticism, that Penn State has all the numbers. They've got, his whole progression there that they can pass along. But, he seemed, pretty confident, pretty, I think, at ease, sort of the typical KJ Winston that we got to know during his time at Penn State. It was interesting reading between the lines a little bit of what he had to say. It really does seem like in hindsight that he knew this was going to be his last year at Penn State. The way that he talks about the injury and the timing of it, where he said that, it was, fortunate that if he were to get hurt, it happened when it did, because, he had all this time to rehab ahead of the process. Whereas if he'd gotten hurt a little later in the year, it would have put him in a tougher situation and everything. And he said it wasn't a difficult decision to decide to declare. And so, I think that with him, we've always seen a confidence with him. He carries it a little bit different than Abdul Carter does in terms of outwardly displaying that confidence. But it was still the same KJ Winston. He's someone that we hadn't really talked to in a long time. I know that some people caught up with him, in some of the locker rooms after the bowl games. That was his first big group setting with Penn State media in a while. And, he seems, pretty comfortable, pretty locked in, and he's going to be a really interesting case on where he goes. If someone, I think we saw him at round 2 in a 7-round mock. What time on day 2 does he get his name called? And so we'll see where he pops up in terms of visits and whatnot over this next month. But you're right. You think about if he'd gone through this whole year healthy, could have been even more fireworks and more attention on Friday.
Yeah, I think he'd be in that conversation to be the top safety in the draft. I really do. And I ultimately believe that if he falls outside of the top 40, let's say, he's going to get a general manager an extension, because he's going to be that kind of pick that proves to be so valuable to you. You're going to pay him a bunch of money for a second contract, but you're going to get such value, and you're going to have a second round pick invested in it. In my opinion, it's going to be a really, really strong setup for whoever ends up landing him at the next level and gets to take his career to the next phase. Ultimately, I think one of the bigger takeaways for me was hearing from Amin Vanover on Friday. It was our first chance to chat with him since his Penn State career came to a close. And unlike KJ Winston, he was trying to fight to stay on this football team. He sent in a waiver request to the NCAA shortly after the Orange Bowl. Him and Penn State trying to get a 6th season of college football eligibility. Ultimately, about a month later, he learned that was denied. He said he decided not to appeal it, just to move forward. During that waiting period, he wasn't an official member of the Penn State football team, but he was living here in State College, obviously fraternizing with the Penn State football family and working out. But he was working out geared towards pro day. And once he got word that it wasn't going to be a continuation of his career with Penn State, he turned all his attention toward that pro day. And staying about 6'4", 260 pounds, went out there, had a 4.76 40-yard dash. Looked pretty trim running around the field through position drills. And he's a guy that, again, we got to see about 1,000 snaps stacked up for his career. He's someone who could have maybe been in that starting conversation at defensive end, opposite of denied Dennis Sutton this past year. But he is coming off of a season in which he proved a lot to himself. I think he put a lot of good film out there. I also thought he was a standout on the defensive line, like many of their linemen during the playoff run. And ultimately, Daniel, he's a guy that showed some versatility during his career. I know he's going to be a defensive end at the next level, but they worked him on the interior. I remember back in 2021, he was much younger. PJ Mustipher goes down. He ends up being kind of a depth piece at defensive tackle. But he's somebody that I think was a good soldier for Penn State for a lot of his career. Maybe didn't get a lot of that attention. I know he was shortchanged by an injury back in 2023, but he was one of their primary 4 defensive ends last year. And he was the number 3 guy behind Abdul Carter and denied Dennis Sutton. So he says it's hard to leave a place like Penn State. In his mind, it would have been great to get a chance to continue here and be a 6-year player with a Zariah Fisher, with a Nick Dawkins, who were also in that 2020 class. But he's aiming to make the most of it. He knows that going undrafted could be on the table. Says it just matters about getting that opportunity. He plans to take advantage of it. And ultimately, Daniel, when you look around and guys who are motivated, I think Amin Vanover has plenty of it. But there is a lot of incentive for Jalen Kimber right now, as well, as you documented in a story for Lions247.com. And by the way, story up on Saturday, a little more in-depth on Amin Vanover's situation, how he ended up handling this winter over at Lions247.com as well.
Yeah, I think with Jalen Kimber, he's the guy who put the number out that really turned heads. He went 4.39 back to back on his 40-yard dash attempts. He said that that's what he expected to run, and that is what he had been running during his time at Penn State. And he didn't get that combine invite, so it was really important for him to do that on Friday at Pro Day. I talked to him a little bit about that combine snub. I think we talked about it a little bit earlier this offseason when the combine was around. That I think he was the one that I think we viewed maybe as the biggest snub of the guys who didn't get invited. I know that when you get into veteran guys, it's kind of like you already know a lot about them. So in terms of fact finding, it's not quite as important to have them out there in Indianapolis. But he was the one, given Penn State's track record at cornerback, the level that he played at, his experience. I think the value of that position at the next level it raised my eyebrows a little bit that he wasn't in Indy. But he said that he was pissed off that he didn't get invited, that he saw the cornerbacks who were there, and he thought that he was of that caliber, that those were his peers in terms of ability, and that is what he wanted to go out and show. And he feels that he did that with his athletic testing. And so, I think that it's going to be interesting to see where he goes. 6 foot, 184. He did 33 and a half inches in the vertical, 10 feet, 3 inches in the broad jump. I believe those are solid marks, for a cornerback, of his size. And we'll see. I mean, I think that he had the reputation as being a physical corner, I think. And he thinks that he's put that on tape, and that is something that NFL teams are really going to want to see from him. But yeah, I mean, it was good to catch up with him. You talk about some of these transfers that come in, and I feel like he was someone that he really let us get to know him a little bit. I made the point on the board and in my story is that when he sounded a little bit like a mercenary when last spring, the first time we talked to him, where the question comes up, you've been at Florida, you've been at Georgia, you're here now, you have an extra year of eligibility on the table after this year. And he was really kind of like, no, I'm not really thinking about using that. It was pretty clear that he was going to try to go one and done here. And when that can kind of come off in a certain way. But I think the more that we talked to him, and the more that we got to know him, is that he really felt like he was getting something out of being here, and that he was putting himself into the program as well. He's talked a lot about Terry Smith and that relationship. And, I think that, he said that Penn State was something that he needed at this stage of his life, both as a player and as a person. And I think that he feels like that, coming out of it, he's in a really, really good spot. And I think that you talk about different guys that you can show in the transfer portal when you're recruiting. I know we thought that Johnny Dixon was a guy that Penn State can say, here, look at what this guy came out as, look at what he finished as. I think Jalen Kimber is going to be another one of those guys too, that, hey, this is what his career was before. This is what it was after his year at Penn State. So I think I think it was definitely a mutually beneficial relationship from Kimber. And, I think that he really appreciated, what this was like for him, which it's cool. It's cool to hear that from these guys, even if they're here for just a short period of time.
Yeah, you're talking about a former top 100 recruit from the state of Texas, who then went to Georgia, who then went to Florida. He's been around big-time football, and I'm with you. He has sounded like he's been grateful for this experience, really going back to our conversations preseason, in season. And he's somebody, you mentioned the physicality. I can tell you this staff was surprised a little bit by the level of physicality, the level of competitive toughness that he brought last spring at this time when he was kind of working his way through the field. Ultimately goes on to start 15 games opposite of another transfer, AJ Harris, and he moves forward. We have a full pro day recap with results. We have a bunch of stories. We probably have a few more stories to trickle out from Friday over at Lions247.com. But I think two more names we need to get to, Daniel, and I'll just kind of lump them together because I think they also helped their stock. Not to say that others did not on Friday, but Keziah Izzard at defensive tackle and then Kobe King at linebacker. I thought both those guys enhanced their opportunities maybe in the eyes of NFL talent evaluators. Izzard has been largely behind the scenes for much of his career, despite being a former blue chip recruit out of Maryland. A backup piece for much of his career. He had some spot starts along the way due to injuries above him on the depth chart, but He weighed in at 298. He told us on Friday at 6'3", went out and ran a 4.81 and the 40-yard dash, had a 4.45 pro shuttle. He had a broad jump of 9 feet 5 inches at his size, and ultimately, he's somebody that when he did get a chance to, kind of rumble in the trenches as a rotational piece, I always was relatively impressed by what he brought to the field. Again, more of a bit player in the grand scheme of things for Penn State's defense the last 2 or 3 years. Yet, a day like this, coming from a defense like this, he's a guy that should give professional scouts plenty to consider.
It's funny sometimes looking at these numbers and testing numbers where Keziah Izzard's vertical was the same as Jalen Kimber and Jalen Reed's, and those are 3 guys with vastly different body types. So I think it shows what Penn State is doing behind the scenes. I know that some people on our board were doing the yeoman's work of looking at the combine results for defensive tackles and seeing where Izzard would have fallen in, and it seems like he would have stacked up favorably with everyone out there in Indianapolis. And so, I think that he's probably, showcased some traits in terms of his athleticism that an NFL team, whether they're, in later on day 3 or even as a UDFA, that, they might see him and say, okay, he doesn't necessarily have this eye-catching production at Penn State, but he has these traits, and let's get him in here, see what we can do with him. And so I think that Izzard, like you said, I think he helped himself with what he did, across Friday. I mean, he's a guy that I think that he doesn't stand out as like a big personality or someone who made these big splashy plays, but not everyone on your team can be, and it takes everyone to get you to where Penn State was at the end of last year. Izzard was a very valuable member of that defense.
And I've said this a few times. I don't know if anyone maximizes their physical frame the way that Kobe King does. I don't know if he's still a pescatarian where he's only eating seafood and really, but he's very body conscious. And he talked about that again on Friday. And there's no flab on this guy. Probably around 240 right now at 6'1". Ran a 4.63 in the 40-yard dash. Went 4.26 in the pro shuttle. He felt like he was able to put some more things on the field in terms of his pass coverage ability that he wasn't really able to do at Penn State, maybe, or maybe that was a bit of a shortcoming in the eyes of some NFL evaluators. He thinks he's been able to establish some of that through some offseason training, preparing for this opportunity, but ultimately was very confident in his decision to turn pro, Daniel. He was somebody that I went face-to-face with in the locker room after the Orange Bowl late night in South Florida, and it was hard to get a read from him on whether he was going to stay or go. Ultimately, what he said, he just felt like he was physically and mentally prepared to take this next step. He thought that he was in the conversation as one of the best linebackers in the country as a redshirt junior, and he felt like it was the right time to make that move. It was interesting to hear him say where he went to when I asked what was the biggest opportunity that was here at Penn State that kind of was teasing you to stay and maybe tempting you to stay. And he said the NIL world has really changed things. So it's interesting where if you're going to be a mid-round draft pick versus how much can you make being a returning starting middle linebacker captain for a college football team, how you weigh those conversations now. But ultimately, Kobe King sounded like a guy who is moving forward with confidence, and he's another guy that would not surprise me if he turns out to be a value pick, depending on where he lands in the draft. And of course, in a few weeks, Daniel, Mark, and myself will do our very embarrassing exercise of trying to project where all the Penn State draft prospects will land across those 7 rounds. So stay tuned for that. Again, we have full pro day results, a bunch of recap and updates over at Lions247.com. I do want to get into a few more items, and Daniel, you brought them to my attention, some kind of leftovers from last week's conversation from our first look at Penn State during week 1 of spring practices. And one of those topics was those freshman receivers. You spent some time kind of sifting through what you saw from the transfer receivers, Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross, but this was also a chance to see 3 freshmen out there in action, going through some competitive periods. What do you want to add to that conversation on a room that really needs some rising talent?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the physical attributes of that trio, Matthew Outen, Lyric Samuel, Kobe Howard, that caught my eye. I think that going into during our roundtable episode, we had to pick our freshmen to watch. I went with Outen over Kobe Howard, and part of my reasoning was you look at what he was listed at on the roster and how that was a little bit of a different body type. He was at 6'1", I think 205 when we did the episode. the next day that got updated to 6'1", 215, and he looks it out there. Like, he is a big dude. He moves really well. I think he's probably going to be pretty raw in terms of the development that Marcus Hagans is going to have to do in terms of route running and everything else that comes into it. But you looked at him going up against some of these Penn State defensive backs and in the one-on-ones we got to watch. It was really, really impressive. I think he had one really good rep against Elliott Washington, where he was able to finish through some very, very physical play from Washington. So Alton is someone who was on my radar, because of that frame, because of his recruiting pedigree, all of that. But getting eyes on him now, I'm kind of like, oh yeah, like this is a guy that we're gonna have to pay attention to. Who knows what it'll look like in September? That's the caveat with all these freshmen, all this spring ball talk. But that first impression, I was like, okay, I see it. Same thing with Kobe Howard. I think 5'11", I believe he's up to 197 on the roster now. He looks just built and ready and solid. A little bit similar to how we talked about Devontae Ross. Even though Ross is a lot lighter, he's still built in a way where you can see that, okay, they can probably withstand the physical side of it and everything that comes across a 13, 14, 15, 16 game season. And I think looking at Kobe Howard, I was kind of like, okay, like this guy, what Chuck Losey was telling us about the effort and dedication, being there early to lifting, that showed through. He looked physically mature, like he's put on good weight since he's been here. So I think that was another positive coming out of it. The last member of that trio, Lyric Samuel, someone we got to watch a lot over the past couple of years in the camp setting, and someone who always impressed me because given how long and lanky he is, I always felt that he still showed good agility and the ability to move pretty quickly, even with those long limbs, those long levers. He's up to 187 on the official roster. I think they listed him at 170 on signing day. He's someone that I think you still look at him as a little bit more of a project because of needing to fill out that frame, needing to get stronger to withstand what you're going to see across Big Ten play. But that eye test on the first day, we've seen him a lot. We've talked to him. We've been face to face with him, and we can see that development. We can see where he's made these gains, and I think that that's interesting to me. I think that maybe with Alton, maybe with Howard, maybe they're guys in August. We're like, okay, are they the number? Where do they fit on like the 3 deep? I don't know if potentially 2 deep. I don't know if we'll get there with Samuel. But to see that early, someone who, like he looked like a twig sometimes, when he was out there, and to see him take to what Chuck Losey is doing, it's kind of like, okay, like it's the first step on being like, is this going to work at this level? And so it looks like he's checked that first box, and now your first spring ball, that's the second box. How can you get through this? What do you show your coaches?
And when you consider that Peter Gonzalez had like a week and a half of practice under his belt before he had his injury last year and missed the rest of the fall, I mean, he's essentially redoing his freshman experience on the practice field. I know he's been on campus for a full year. He's working through with a brace on his leg right now, but he's somebody that's back out there and going through full drills. And I tell you what, if Marcus Hagans wanted some new material to work with, he's got it. And these freshmen, getting Peter Gonzalez back, the 2 transfer receivers, and so now we'll see how it all sorts out. But some interesting early observations there from you, Daniel. And of course, across the field, there's not a lot of questions about the cornerback room. Yes, they lost the man we just discussed in Jalen Kimber. Yes, they lost an experienced veteran in Cam Miller, who transferred over to Rutgers. But a couple guys clearly are risers in that room, and they're veterans. And one of them has been flashing signals to everybody all year long, because Terry Smith went 6 for 6 and describing him as his performer competitor of the day there in the cornerback room for winter workouts. I noted it in my defensive notebook coming off the field. And if you didn't check these out, last Tuesday, after the first long look at practice, Daniel had a very long offensive notebook. I had a pretty long defensive notebook. So check those out. One of the guys I spotlighted there was Elliott Washington, saying, yeah, you can see he's got the levers, he's got the speed, he's got the aggression. I saw him break up multiple passes in those one-on-one settings late in that practice period. And he seems to be in command right now at the cornerback spot. You also had some notes to pass along on Washington.
I think if you want an idea of where Washington's confidence is right now, he showed up to pro day in a purple tracksuit. So where you really couldn't miss him. But no, like last week, I think the one rep that really stood out to me was one of his breakups where he was going up against Josiah Brown, and it was a pass over the middle. Brown caught it, went to make the turn, and Washington finished the rep. He goes in, contacts, punches the ball out, and I got a really big reaction from everyone who was watching. And I think that's an example of what Terry Smith was seeing during those workouts translating over to the practice field in terms of that competitive edge, finishing a rep, going a little bit above and beyond what you're doing. To me, that was exemplified by that, because sometimes you see guys that give up a catch in those one-on-ones, they let the receiver just kind of go. It's like, okay, the rep's over. But Washington finished it, and I think that Josiah Brown, I think hopped up and shoved Washington back down. It was, we saw a little bit of edge from both of them there. But I think that is an example of that competitive nature, and maybe one of the more like intangible things, or just one of the things that's tougher to measure, across that we got to see now with our own eyes. And I think something that might bode well, for Elliott Washington.
And just to stack upon that, I wanted to note that the buzz that we continue to get from Aldavian Collins is really no different than where it was last year. I think we're just getting more used to it. And we waited a while. Let's be honest. September came, October came. We weren't really seeing the Aldavian Collins usage and production on the field on game days that we had heard about through spring ball and preseason camp. But guess what? When it mattered the most for this Penn State squad in the postseason, he was out there a bunch. He was playing significant reps late in the regular season through the playoff run, and he was entrenched as a piece of that cornerback room. Part of it was Elliott Washington wasn't available for a significant stretch in November. Part of it was he just edged some other guys out for reps. And, I mean, you hear from people on the staff about where he is right now. Just as much as everyone wants to put Elliott Washington in the conversation as a slam dunk starter opposite of A.J. Harris, who's back after starting 15 games last year, Aldavian Collins is going to give him a run for his money on the outside. And it feels like we're in a spot that is familiar at cornerback under Terry Smith year by year by year, where you can say there's not really going to be two starters. There's going to be 3 or 4 starters. Zion Tracy finished last year as a starter in the slot. We'll see what that fifth defensive back piece looks like next season. But you'd imagine Zion Tracy, a guy like King Mack, will be in contention there in the slot. And then you work your way through who the cornerback's going to be playing a bunch. There's a lot of young dudes, but Collins is now a 4th-year college player, started at Mississippi State, has played playoff football at this point. And then Elliott Washington is in year 3, and A.J. Harris proved a lot. And so I think a lot of the dialogue and feedback that we've had from within the Lash building has been, if you're looking for a reason why a guy like Cam Miller might have explored other options, maybe look at what Aldavian Collins is showing in that position room. I mean, that's maybe not the direct exact point A to point B correlation, but you can read between the lines a little bit. And he is a guy on the rise still, although Elliott Washington might be taking the ultimate guy on the rise title in that room right now. Although, wasn't it A.J. Harris who was the initial defender of the day, which is something that we're going to have to get used to around here, apparently. Jim Knowles, these first few spring practices, putting out his defender of the day. It was A.J. Harris. It was Zakee Wheatley. I don't know if we got one from practice 3 out of the weekend yet, Daniel. Frankly, I'm amazed that Jim Knowles is putting any extra effort into anything on social media. It doesn't seem like his cup of tea. Maybe he has somebody doing for him. But this is something he brought over from Ohio State, I guess. And no surprise to see A.J. Harris and Zakee Wheatley among those early mentions. And hopefully we'll get 15 of them over the course of the spring practice schedule.
I know it's something that, for all of us, that we take any little info, any little data that we can get. And, it's up to us to decide how much stock we want to put into it. But yeah, I mean, I think that to have someone from that secondary, which has a lot of guys back, a lot of guys that have played a lot of football and a lot of talent, to see those first 2 shout outs from Jim Knowles to come from corner and safety. I think it tracks with where you have, I think maybe I don't want to say like the least questions, fewest questions, because going to have to replace Jalen Reed. We don't know, how safeties or how corners going to shake out in terms of the position battles there. But we know that that's where Penn State has done a great job stockpiling talent. And I think it's a testament to Terry Smith and Anthony Poindexter that, those 2 positions have had guys that have really stood out in a lot of different areas all winter long and now in the spring.
Yeah, I'll just say that defensive backfield with Terry, with Anthony Poindexter, benefit of the doubt is in place. I know we've applied that to Ty Howell at tight end. We did it for Jaywan Sider at running back over the years. we can do that for those two guys with what they've done year by year in that room, who they have coming in, who they have going out. It'll be fun to track. Again, we're back on the practice field Tuesday. We'll let you know what we see, what we hear. We're going to get James Franklin after practice. We're going to get a few players, some assistant coaches as well. So we're really ramping up our coverage at lions247.com. Tuesday evening, it'll be a great time to visit. And if you take advantage of that 50% off deal, even better, or $1 for 1 month going on right now. Daniel, we'll give the people some updates on Tuesday. We'll get back with another podcast later in the week and kind of cycle through some of that information and bring it to our listeners here on the podcast. But thanks as always for jumping in and having some dialogue.
Thanks for having me, Tyler.
All right. Good stuff from Daniel Gallen. Before him, you heard from Tyler Calvaruso. You can catch both their content along with mine and Mark Brennan's over at lions247.com. For now, we're going to step aside, say goodbye, get back to work over on the site, back with a second episode later this week. And by then, we'll have seen another practice session for Penn State as they make their march toward the April 26th blue-white game in Beaver Stadium. For now, stepping aside, thanks to everyone for listening. Lions 24/7 podcast.